Just going to bring in our next guest before I do. Look, it's a difficult conversation to have, but we do need to have it, because the problem with nuclear weapons is if they exist, they can be used. That seems probably quite an obvious truth, but sometimes obvious truths need to be stated. This world is the world in which we live is a tinderbox. By tomorrow, well, actually, within 2 hours, human civilization could just be wiped out. That's the reality of the existence of nuclear weapons. Before I bring in Beatrice, we've got a small clip. I should warn you, although this is there are worse clips, I have to say. This is from a BBC programme which had a big impact on me growing up. It was called Threads. It was actually based in Sheffield, which is where I was born. And it's about what would happen if a nuclear war happened. And you see throughout the first half, growing tensions in Iran at the time. This was in the early 80s. The Soviet forces invade Iran. Then there's a use of a tactical nuclear weapon, and then nuclear war happens. And the message from this film is, if nuclear war happens, there is no hope. And the reason it's important to say this is lots of people are flippantly calling for a no-fly zone, understandably angry and distressed about the invasion without thinking about the implications. Others are simply saying we should just go to war with Russia and nuclear war wouldn't happen. Let's just see this clip. I should warn you, it's not easy viewing, but there are worse.
Jesus Christ, dummy.
Those are actually the scenes before the main bombs land. If you're going to watch Threads, which I think everybody should, do it in an afternoon. Don't watch it at night and go for a walk afterwards. Let me bring in the brilliant Beatrice Fihn. We're so sorry, Beatrice. We kept you waiting for so long, which I'm hugely apologetic about. We're so lucky to have you. Now, Beatrice Fihn is the executive director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which was the Nobel Prize winner in 2017. Hello, good to see you.
Thank you.
So I suppose a lot of people go, look, we don't need to have this conversation. There's not going to be a nuclear war. It's exceptionally unlikely. Even talking about it is just fear-mongering. What would you say?
It doesn't feel as exceptionally unlikely right now. I don't say that it is likely, and just watching this clip of Threads even now, it's really, really difficult to see. It's very hard to say how likely it is, or make a quantitative estimate, right, on exactly how it could happen. But what we do know is that it's more likely now than it was like 3 weeks ago. And the risk, and we've been warning about this, it's not just us, scientists, experts for many years have seen these trends, unraveling of arms control agreements, increased hostility between nuclear armed states, upgrading and modernization of nuclear arsenals, and have warned that this, we're in a really bad situation, and we see an increasing trend where nuclear war might happen. And I think now more than ever, I think people are really acutely aware of how fragile it is, this kind of idea that it won't happen. And it also relies really on that the leaders in charge of these nuclear arsenals, that they act rational and that they think about the consequences of their actions, and not just for themselves, but for people all over the world. So I wouldn't say that it's likely to happen, but I think that the risk is definitely increasing right now.
Now, if we just talk through what a nuclear war, how it could start. I mean, in Threads, interestingly, it involves an invasion, the Soviet invasion of Iran, a fictitious invasion, which obviously didn't happen, in order to install a puppet regime. So there are some parallels. And then you just get this gradual escalation, and you can hear people are going to the pub, they're getting on with their lives, they're settling down and getting a new home. And you just hear the constant, and people are cutting it, ignoring it. They're not taking it seriously. And then it becomes more and more deadly serious. How do you think in this situation we could end up in that scenario with, like we saw with Threads? How could it escalate, do you think, in the current scenario to that level?
I mean, we're seeing, just as you talked with Vladimir before, we see this kind of conversation about a no-fly zone, where maybe NATO will go in and engage in the war right now. And Putin has very seriously, before the war started, the week before, he did a massive exercise with all of his nuclear forces. He then opened the war and the invasion by stating that if anyone tries to interfere with this, you will see consequences that you've never seen before. And then, of course, on Sunday, he announced that he was increasing the nuclear threat levels, or the threat levels of his nuclear forces. So we, of course, can see how this current conflict can quite quickly escalate. And a lot of experts say that the most likely scenario of nuclear war is after a time of conventional war. It kind of triggers maybe a tactical nuclear weapon, or just kind of like this idea of escalate to de-escalate. But that's not the only way that we can end up in nuclear war. We can also see mistakes and accidents. For example, falsified data, incoming kind of information that is misread, that can sort of trigger an accidental nuclear war. We've seen many near misses during the Cold War, where solar flares on satellites, reflecting on satellites, were taken as incoming missile, for example, and only cool heads and clear judgment at that time sort of prevented the automatic response of counter launch. And when we see this very dangerous kind of massive tensions and worry and jumpiness right now, you can also see how any small mistake can kind of trigger really awful consequences. So we could also stumble into nuclear war by accident, making this an extremely dangerous situation right now.
Now, I've just been seeing some of the things people were saying on social media. Some people say, well, the Russian military is not doing so well in Ukraine with its equipment. Maybe its missiles are all, its nuclear weapons are duds.
Well, I mean, this is really the danger, and also what Vladimir earlier said, that a cornered leader that has no way out, but has a lot of nuclear weapons. I mean, Russia has the most nuclear weapons in the entire world of all countries. Just a little bit more than the United States, but those two countries have the most absolute nuclear weapons. It really makes you feel also that these weapons are meant to be like the last resort, right? But last resort for who? For a dictator's personal survival. And I think that that's really a big worry right now, that we don't know if he will take rational decisions. I mean, I don't think that there's any rational decisions regarding nuclear weapons, but to see a person very cornered like that with maybe no kind of way out. But on the other hand, also the war is continuing without nuclear weapons. And I think that this justification of having nuclear weapons, that it somehow keeps peace and security, creates stability, has really gone out of the window right now. We can see how nuclear weapons are not used to protect Russia, but that he's using his nuclear weapons to basically tell everyone to back off, stay out, let me invade Ukraine and do whatever I want to Ukrainian people. And I so much empathize with the Ukrainian president when he calls for a no-fly zone, but also the West having nuclear weapons. And I'm thinking about the United States, UK, and France, for example, in NATO, prevents them from helping. And it really triggers these enormous questions that there are no good answers. Like, how many Ukrainians would have to die before we risk starting a nuclear war? I mean, obviously, nothing justifies, starting a nuclear war. But how are we just going to be able to watch? So these nuclear weapons clearly do not create stability and peace. It doesn't create any sort of balance right now. It just leaves Ukraine completely on its own. And I think that's really a consequence of nuclear weapons.
You have to say, when there are various people on social media, and they'll say if you oppose a no-fly zone on the basis it could lead to a military conflict and nuclear war, that's sacrificing Ukraine. But of course, in the event of nuclear war, Ukraine would be sacrificed in the most literal sense, along with the Northern Hemisphere. Look, this is a morbid conversation, but it's necessarily morbid because I do think the reality has to be painted. Threads was very effective because it made people... A lot of people, I think of nuclear war and they imagine kind of wandering around a slightly broken up urban landscape, and that they haven't really thought through the reality. If a nuclear exchange took place between East and West, what would that actually mean? What would happen?
Well, first, if one nuclear weapon is used, I mean, you have things like you saw in the clip, of course, the flash that blinds people if you look at it. Then the blast that will just knock over buildings, explode all windows for kilometers out. And all of this depends, of course, on the size of the bomb and the terrain of the ground where it's used. And then, the fireball, that is the core of the fireball is hotter than the surface of the sun. I mean, it will burn and melt everything. Bodies will vaporize. And then, of course, the fires that will burn everything flammable. Which will also suck out oxygen and create these kind of firestorms in the surrounding areas. And then, of course, the radiation that will fall down on people who have survived the initial attack, meaning that it's anything from a few hours until, decades later, you can still feel the consequences and die from the consequences. And it's absolutely horrible to think about. And, we have worked with also actors like the UN humanitarian agencies, the International Committee of the Red Cross, who have looked into what would they as sort of first responders do in case of a nuclear detonation. And they basically conclude that they can do nothing. They will pull their staff out because of the radiation, because they're not allowed to put their own people in jeopardy. And there will be no sort of hospitals able to treat patients. There will be no doctors that will be able to help, no blood transfusions, no not enough burn beds in the entire world to just kind of deal with the impact of just one nuclear detonation. And of course, I mean, that's, everyone who would survive the initial bomb would be left alone. Help would not come. And if you talk about full-scale nuclear war, I mean, in addition to this happening over and over in many different places, you also have, of course, the soot and the smoke from the bombs and from the firestorms that come that will kind of turn into a cloud in the atmosphere. This kind of nuclear winter that we talked a lot about in the 80s that will drastically cool the climate very, very quickly, knock out global crops of corn and rice, for example, and cause mass starvation all over the world. I mean, the food supplies, globally will be completely devastating. So over the next decade, billions of people would starve to death. I mean, that's what we talk about when we talk about full-scale war, nuclear war. And I know this is extremely difficult to talk about. I mean, I've spent a lot of time myself working on this issue, talking about this over and over, saying we must take this seriously. But right now, it's really difficult even for me to say these things. And I think that it's extremely anxiety-inducing. And I just want to flag that's completely normal to feel completely overwhelmed and anxious about this, because it is so massive, this threat, that it's hard to process as an individual.
Before we will end, I know it seems hard for people to imagine, we're going to end on a hopeful note, I promise. I mean, again, this is morbid. In the exchange, in the event of a nuclear exchange between East and West, many will go, well, that would be devastating for the Northern Hemisphere, but it seems unlikely that Rio de Janeiro would be bombed, that Sydney would be bombed, that much of Africa would be bombed. So even though hundreds of millions of Americans and Europeans would perish, maybe the rest of human civilization would just be able to survive.
Of course, there will be survivors. And I think that's also important to remember, because we sometimes have this idea that nuclear war is almost like a computer game. Once you take these decisions, it's game over and we all end, it all ends. But that's not the case. There were a lot of survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for example, who have lived long lives. And, somebody has to deal with the consequences. and somebody has to be responsible for trying to, piece people together again afterwards. So of course, an immediate sort of nuclear war, say in Europe, would completely devastate the whole continent. But these kind of long-term implications on food security, on food production, on the climate kind of catastrophe that would follow, a nuclear winter, that would not just be for the Northern Hemisphere, that would be for the entire world. So there will be mass consequences, mass starvation, deaths all over the world. There will be no place on Earth that would be left sort of unbothered from this. And we see also with things like, it's very similar in a way to the issues around climate change and pandemic. You can't isolate these kind of existential threats. It's not one place and like, it's not us, so we're fine. This really concerns everyone. And I think that's also why it's so important that everyone is engaged in this issue and has a voice on this issue, because it's not just the 9 nuclear armed states or maybe Europe. It's really a global issue.
As we said, this is very anxiety inducing and people will find it difficult to listen to. But given a threat, if you thought there was a 0.5% chance that you were going to get killed on the way to the shop, you would consider that a serious threat worth engaging with. And we're talking here about the future of human civilization. We don't know if there's other life in the universe. We can hope based on the odds there are. But actually, given we don't have any evidence of any other forms of life in the universe, as things stand, what a gamble to take with the only intelligent life we are aware of, where people live and love as intelligent social animals. What a gamble to take with that, to wipe that out as we know it. In terms of what people can do, because people think about this and they just want to push it out of their mind. They don't want to think about it. They feel helpless. They feel impotent. They're upset and angry about the invasion of Ukraine. But obviously they see this threat of nuclear war. What can people do? What can people who are worried about this huge existential menace, which would be the death of all of us as we know it, what can they do?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's important, like if you feel sort of super anxious at the moment and really worried, I've had so many phone calls and messages this last week about people sort of, I'm terrified, like I can't sleep. I think it's important to remember that it hasn't happened yet, which means that we have a chance to stop it. And there are a lot of people working to stop it. And I think that the kind of way that also other governments with nuclear weapons have responded to Putin's threat to use nuclear weapons shows that they're taking this seriously. But long term, like immediately, of course, Ukrainians have suffered right now, and that's a big focus. But long term, we have to remove this threat, because even if it's like a 0.5% chance that this will happen, given enough time, if we keep doing this over and over again, we already were very lucky during the whole Cold War. We didn't avoid nuclear war just by skill. It was just pure luck, and we keep pushing that luck. Eventually, statistically speaking, right, it will happen. So we can really decide: do we eliminate nuclear weapons after they've been used or before they've been used? So there are like a lot of efforts. I mean, we were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for the work that we did with the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which really mobilizes these other countries, African countries, Latin American countries, Asia Pacific countries, to say that, hey, we don't want to be a part of this. We do not want to die in nuclear war, because 9 individual, all men at the moment, are, trust them. I mean, do we as a whole world, and you put it very well, Owen, the humanity as we know it, do we put that in the hands of Putin right now and say he's responsible to take care of this? I mean, it's absolutely bizarre. So this treaty is really, nuclear disarmament is not going to happen overnight. It's a long process, but I think that now we're really understanding that we can't let this happen anymore. We can't leave it be completely legitimate. What Putin is doing is completely in line with nuclear deterrence theory. So everyone is advocating that we need nuclear weapons. There you go. This is what happens when we have nuclear weapons, and when we say that it's okay to threaten with these weapons, and that creates peace and stability. It doesn't. So we really have to start working to eliminate nuclear weapons. And I think that the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons was a UN negotiated treaty. It was adopted by the General Assembly because the Security Council is completely deadlocked on this issue and cannot agree because the vetoes there. So the General Assembly took this up in 2017, and we've been working to get more and more governments to join this treaty. We need people to speak out. We need governments to get to the table. I think that there's, of course, really devastating scenario right now, but I can't see how Putin can come back into the international community and continue like before. So, of course, we don't know what's going to happen with this war. It might be massive, devastating impact, maybe nuclear war. But if we manage to survive this crisis, I think there's an opportunity to get nuclear armed states to the table to negotiate this. And we should use the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Organizations like ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, we're not starting from scratch. So if people are worried and just starting to think about this right now, there are organizations like ours. We have over 600 NGOs in 108 countries. We have loads of parliamentarians. We have people like the Pope and the Catholic Church behind us. We have cities all over the world. New York's, Washington, Paris, Manchester in the UK have adopted motions like supporting this treaty and saying we have to do something about this problem. So there is a lot of things. So I would really encourage people to support the people who work on this issue. As soon as we see these crises, people don't have to start over from the beginning. There are movements and organizations already working that, and they need your support and your engagement right now.
Just final couple of questions from people who are watching. David Browata asks, is it possible to develop a reliable anti-nuke defense shield which makes nukes obsolete? That was the Star Wars program, wasn't there, under Ronald Reagan, which attempted to achieve that. And the other from Peter D'Souza, did the Cold War ever end?
Well, I mean, the US has been working on this missile shield for a long time. This idea that you can take out a nuclear missile, which then, of course, means that even if you launch nuclear weapons, the other side, they can be taken out. It doesn't work. It's impossible. And also it's impossible if they fire several at the same time. They've spent enormous amount of money on this kind of like trying to develop these kind of missile shields. And they work like 1 out of 10 times they can target the missile. And that's just not good enough. It also kind of triggers, like if trying to create this kind of defense also triggers the incentive to use nuclear weapon first and quick and like immediately in a conflict before the other side do it, which completely kind of encourages nuclear war. So it's actually really dangerous. The Cold War, if it ended, I mean, of course it officially ended. We had an opportunity, I think, in the 90s to really get on with nuclear disarmament, and we missed it. And in many ways, it's a little bit like things like stopping smoking. It's never a good time. When it's good times, like, oh, we don't need to do it now. Everything is fine. Russia is fine. When it's bad time, well, we can't do it now because now it's really dangerous. Now we need them. It's never the best, like a great time to stop and to work on nuclear disarmament. So we really did miss a massive opportunity at the end of the Cold War. The Reagan-Gorbachev meeting was an opportunity where they were this close to actually agree on disarming the nuclear arsenals. And that can happen again. We can be in that same situation again. These massive, huge crises can also lead to a complete change. So if we want this crisis now to be a wake-up call, we have to push our politicians and push the kind of conversation to demand that we need to take this opportunity and this fear that people are feeling right now and turn it into political action and make sure that we take the opportunity after this crisis maybe to progress with nuclear disarmament.
Beatrice, it's been such an honor to have you. And just so anyone who's either watching or listening on the podcast who wants to support the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, we've got a link here, which I think we're going to flash up on the screen. Here we go. So if you go to www.icanw.org/join, then you can support the brilliant efforts of what is a Nobel Peace Prize winning organization, which very courageously fights quite an important fight, I would say, for the continued existence of human civilization. I think it's important to say this because, I mean, when we're discussing what we're looking at is a brutal and criminal invasion of Ukraine in which civilians are being massacred by Putin's forces. And when those of us who've argued, for example, against a no-fly zone, which in practice means a shooting Russian military planes out the sky zone, this is kind of, you're an apologist for Putin. When Actually, it's just being an apologist for the continued existence of humanity as a species. It's the most precious thing we have, the life that we all have on Earth. And we do have the power to obliterate it in a very, very, very short space of time. And I don't think people have really often appreciated that, which is why talking to you and having it spelled out in what many people will find pretty gruesome and macabre terms, that is the reality we would face if this crisis escalates to that point. And people do need to be aware of that, because that risk does exist. It always exists, but it becomes more acute at a time like this. So we need to discuss it, even if people find that upsetting. So thank you so much, Beatrice. Honestly, it's been such an honor, and I hope people will do all they can to support your brilliant organization in its sterling efforts. And people, if they're watching, they can see the link, but I'll include the link in the podcast description so people can click there as well. So lots of love. Take care of yourself, and thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.